Hi, I'm Machiavelli, and I'd still wreck Thorin at Quake, and I'm welcoming you to Thorin's YouTube channel.
Right, I'm here for another episode of Reflections, and this one is going to be an interesting one because this is with a very, very old school player, because it's someone who was playing, put it this way, before the 2000s. So even people who think esports is old, there's always those people who say that stuff, mate, like, oh, I'm old school, I'll go back to like 2008. It's like, mate, you're fucking new pop compared to the rest of us, To us, it's like, well, what were you waiting for? So Unholy here is someone who you might know from his association with the very famous Death Row clan, which is obviously most famous for Thresh, and then maybe a little bit Machiavelli, if people know them, later Immortal. There's a few names if people know the West Coast Quake scene, essentially. But I actually want to start here. For your interview, since you weren't a guy who played a million of the tournaments, you played some of them, mainly like some of the Quake 2 lands and stuff, and obviously the team deathmatch stuff early on. I wanted to also make some of this interview kind of like giving people a flavour for what it was like to be an online gamer back then. Because one of the things that I always think is a funny thing, which also shows kind of what I was talking about there, the people who think they're old school, but they're not as old school as they think, is, they always make fun that, I used to just compete for, a keyboard or a graphics card. And it's like, mate, that was like, at the beginning, you competed for nothing. When you could get some actual tech, that was a pretty good prize, right?
Let me see. I got to dig something out of my desk here. I got to get a few things that might be interesting. I know this is probably awkward for like kicking.
It's all right, I'll edit this part out. Yeah, we'll edit this.
Okay. I found these recently, and I don't want to leave my Unforgiven brothers out, but I can't find their card right now. But check this stuff out.
Oh, yeah, from the PGL. Yeah,
from the PGL, yeah. It's funny. The back is like, it reads like a bad like high school dating thing,
Right.
It's like, what are your hobbies? Web design, working out, partying, and basketball.
I thought that was cool at the time.
Totally. This card's awesome.
There you go. Yeah.
But yeah, no, you're
so okay. Along those lines, because if people don't know, basically, I think part of the problem is maybe they've heard about Thresh, right? So they might know, wow, you won a Ferrari and you won prize. It's like you basically had to be first place to like make money in that sense. Like otherwise, it was always a hobby, right?
Yeah, no, and I think that was that really defined esports in the mid '90s, sort of when it started to actually become an organized thing. Was unlike any other developing sport. And I think you saw this. I have a bunch of family members who are surfers, and my niece is actually on the professional tour right now.
Okay.
She was ranked 6th or 7th in the world a few years ago. She's won the U.S. Open of surfing 2 out of the last 3 years down in Huntington Beach. So I kind of see some parallels from the early action sports days. My family was big into surfing and skateboarding and owned shops out here in California. Right. And, not unlike when pro gaming was sort of becoming a concept in the mainstream, they're really, how many people, knew of skateboarders other than Tony Hawk, and how many people know surfers more than Kelly Slater? And,
yes,
unless you're in the inside community, I think, that's one of the challenges for a developing sport is that, you have to kind of create this icon and this figure, and, you pump them up and you put them out there, and that's sort of, they become the ambassador for the sport. And that was kind of what I was excited about, as I could really tell the esports was growing when, people started to acknowledge and talk about, how there were a lot of good, talented players that were playing. And I think that was always one of the narratives that I was trying to get across to the media when I was playing, was that, hey, there is we do have the Michael Jordan of gaming. His name is Dennis Fong, and there are a lot of talented people, probably at least 10, 15 people that, and I use the football term, on any given Sunday could have a chance at basically winning this thing. And so, but yeah, no, esports was definitely very dominated by, that, and followed that traditional path of, there really was only room for one in the media for so long as it was developing.
And in that sense, like when you were starting out, basically, if you've alluded to like web design stuff, was your job some sort of tech job? Were you like what, network engineer or web designer or something? What were you doing to support yourself when you played?
So I was, I think I was in my last year of high school, or had just graduated. Yeah, it was about my last year of high school. I had some friends who worked in web development in a city, a couple miles away from where I lived, and they were just real life friends that I had. And I went over there one night, and these guys were. I mean, they knew I was a huge gamer, and there was one guy who was really responsible for getting me involved in Quake. His name was he was in Death Row. His handle was Twisted Killer. His name was Rusty Russell. And he was an older guy, and he was friends with my brother and surfed with my brother. And he said, "Hey, you got to come over here to the office, and check out what we're doing." And I came in and I saw a dark room with a bunch of people, playing games on computers, and it was shooter and fast paced, and I was like, "Whoa, this is really awesome." And then it kind of sunk in, and they told me like we're playing with other people like out on the internet, and this is a multiplayer thing. And I always was a big competitive gamer. I started playing, obviously played all the console systems and games, but my first, foray into competitive gaming was like Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter, and I was like a big arcade gamer. My parents would drop me off with, $1 and leave me at the mall for 2 hours when I was a kid, and they'd be like, "Well, what do you need for a drink?" And I'm like, "No, that's all I need. I need like 25 cents to play, and 75 cents for a drink, and I'll be good."
It was
for
the
2
winner's day on,
hours.
I guess, and you just beat everyone in the
Exactly, yeah.
arcade, right?
People
okay.
lining up quarters on the on the screen, waiting to play, and
people think that's a movie thing, because obviously like they have done that scene in movies, but people don't get it. Like the real way it was is like in your day, for example, like famously Thresh almost never got to play people from other countries. It was very rare. He would like he went to the UK once maybe. So if people don't know, it really was that
don't
logic.
Forget about High Roller.
Yes, sure, but it really was that logic of like, I'm trying to be the best in my city, and then in my I'll go to a land in my state, and then maybe I remember in your era it was like the West Coast and the East Coast didn't even play each other because people's ping was too bad, right? So was it kind of that mentality of like you're just working your way out to find opponents?
It was, yeah, and I think that was a huge issue with being a competitive gamer in that era was, I moved up to Northern California to go to UC Berkeley, and when I moved up there, I actually went to a college before called De Anza. I was living with one of our teammates, Frick, Wes Culver. He lived in Cupertino, and we were gaming so much together that like it just made sense to like go up there and kind of like live in the same house. And he housed me up there for a while, and we were just all under the same roof gaming. And that was when in the United States, At Home was a company that was rolling out a cable modem infrastructure up in the Bay Area, and it was like, it's coming in 2 months, and we were like, hell yeah. And then it was like, it's coming 2 months after that, and lo and behold, fast forward 18 months, and like they still hadn't rolled their stuff out. So when I was first playing Quake, the web design office down here in Los Angeles, they had a T1 set up. And the T1
at the time would have been unreal, right? That would be like the shit.
No, it was that's all I knew, getting going. But then when I decided that I wanted to also game from home and not just bring my computer to a LAN party every day at the office, I sort of was awakened to the harsh reality that I needed a connection. So I got an ISDN and was paying sub-obscene amount of money.
Yes, I've no doubt, because it's per minute,
until I
right?
figured out how to like
yes,
there's a way to hack it so that like you connected analog and then the ISP switched you digitally, and then so you didn't have to pay per minute, and it was there was a whole workaround about it, but it's still like $100 a month for a high school kid. But I had a really good ISDN connection, and I played 95% of the time from the office, and it was more the social aspect that was developing between me and these guys, that was, that's what I was drawn to, and the camaraderie of playing together. And, basically a team was being formed, in front of our eyes. And we didn't know it at the time, but they started a clan called Extreme Prejudice, XP,
yes,
which is where I started my gaming career, and learned from playing the guys locally there. A few of them turned into Death Row members. There kind of was a merger at one point between Clan Extreme Prejudice and Clan Legends, which was
another very famous TDM team.
Yeah, Thresh and B2 and Cross and a lot of the guys from the Bay Area. We sort of this guy Rusty, who unfortunately, Twisted Killer I mentioned, he passed away several months ago. He had a massive heart attack, which he recovered from, but then ended up passing away from cancer. So I actually just found out, 3 or 4 days ago. So it's kind of still emotional topic for me. Um, but yeah, he really was one of the connectors. This guy Rusty, and he sort of was the one I think that was responsible for Death Row coming together by merging the two clans. And I guess I'm skipping ahead a little bit. When I was in XP, we had a guy that was playing. His name was Killjoy, and he was probably the best player in Extreme Prejudice. And I really just, my approach to gaming and competing was to play the best possible player that I had access to, and to just play them until I was better than them. And I think that happened eventually with Killjoy, and I sort of became the breakout player on XP, although it wasn't really something that I was conscious of. We were just winning and competing. But when Death Row was formed, there was definitely, I guess when I was in XP, that's when the Ferrari qualifiers happened. And who did that? Was it M Player?
It was at E3 and all that, so I'm not sure who.
So there was a
nationwide.
nationwide online qualifier that used.
It sounds like M Player. That was a pretty famous company back then.
I think it was M Player, and they did what they had some piece of software where it automatically launched you into servers. And thinking back on it, really remarkable technology.
Sure,
that they had
for that time period,
yeah, for that time period. I mean, I know because we tried later on after I sort of stepped out of esports and went into GGL and to try to advance some of that side of esports. I kind of saw what they did, and we tried to reproduce what they did, and they really had integrated it quite well for what they did. But after that qualifier, I did qualify for the Ferrari tournament, and that was an experience in itself. And I think that whole experience of being flown to Atlanta at E3 and meeting some of these other people that had qualified, Thresh.
Had you already met these guys online, or had you actually met with them all in person at this point?
I gotta say, I don't remember if we had met them in person at this point yet or not. I think that I may just in infamy had seen, or just had seen what had happened through like reading about tournaments. Maybe it was Blues News. I don't even know who was covering at the time. It's been so long now that like my memory is a little spotty about some of this stuff. But the XP, I mean the Ferrari tournament, Red Annihilation, was when these people were finally brought together to compete on LAN, and it was quite an experience. I definitely knew who Dennis was. We weren't I don't think that we were like as friendly as we were after.
He's a bit standoffish when he's a competitor, right? Like even the people, his teammates, it sounds like he was trying to beat him every single time,
Yeah, there was one moment, when Dennis was there and we were like, watching matches, and he was like, everyone was kind of sitting on the ground looking up at screens, and I saw his hand on the ground, and I'm like, ooh, maybe I should step on that.
Okay.
I'm just kidding, but I had that thought as like, there was such a competitive group, but like, that was really the moment, the Red Annihilation tournament, that made me believe in the potential and future for esports. And I think it sort of planted a seed inside of me, which would eventually sort of define probably the next 12 years of what I did in esports, both as a player and then also getting into the business and the business side of it, and trying to parlay being a player into helping try to develop it into a sport and build a community around it.
One thing I want to ask, actually, because again, this is something that people might not understand about like the time period, is first of all, as you pointed out, like the story about the Rusty guy, that's another thing, is the reason why later, for example, when people like Immortal come along, that was like a big story, is because I mean, I was like a 16-year-old kid at this time, mate. And as you can imagine, like my parents didn't just let me go on the internet all the time. I had to sneak in there, go on the connection, pay per minute and stuff. So actually, average gamers were older. And then it was people where like, this is what I want to ask about, is in the modern day, obviously people use that buzzword all the time, toxicity, and like they don't want anyone to be mean on the internet and stuff. But like, it was kind of almost like a pick-up basketball mentality back then, right? It was like, if you're going to play, people are going to talk shit. And if you can't handle it, it's like, that's part of the game. It's kind of like, it was dog eat dog world, right?
It was, yeah, no, it definitely was. And, And basketball is a great analogy because I played basketball for almost 10 years of my life, and it was my favorite sport, and so I think that, and I love professional tennis too. And I think that the reason why I love professional tennis is because it's a one-on-one sport. And I always really was more gravitated towards I like being having no one else to hold accountable for my success
Right.
or failure than myself. And that was why I always gravitated to being a dueler. But there really was something special. And I had the most success in my career, as being part of a team. And I think that it definitely was a doggy dog world. I think it definitely was. I mean, you hear about professional athletes and basketball stars, and Michael Jordan was known for being a huge asshole. And I think that we all had that streak in us. You have to have a certain level of cockiness in you to, um, you know, give yourself a compartmentalized belief that you can win, and that you deserve to win. And definitely a lot of that bled through in competition. And then going back to commenting on the sort of modern era of you know I think that a lot of things that are wrong in the world today happen to do. I grew up from a different era. I'm 42 years old, so I grew up in the 90s. I went to school in the late 80s and early 90s, and it was a different time. It was a rougher time. People would get in fights at school. I mean, I'm not saying that it doesn't happen anymore, but like, I felt like there was, you could always be held accountable for being an asshole and for what you
Well,
said
yes.
by getting a punch in the face, or
Certainly, yeah.
like. And I think that a lot of people have never really experienced. Like, I've had my ass kicked numerous times in my life, usually
I
not
mean,
much,
dude,
but
even in the online aspect, like you might talk shit to
yeah.
someone. If you go to the LAN next time, well, it wasn't a big esports event. Like that guy might just punch you in the head there.
Right,
You
and
know?
I had numerous. I think that was one of the interesting things about me is I kind of broke the mold, and this was one of the things that I was really proud of my history being involved in esports is, I was a little bit of a broke the mold because I was a basketball player. My family was in surfing, and I was into fitness, and I kind of had this persona that I knew was attractive to the PGL when they signed me, and I was put in front of the local media a lot to sort of advocate for competitive gaming and gamers because at the time the narrative that the media was running with was that gamers were these dysfunctional people that were in the cellars of their parents' house.
Yes.
And
It's
I
basically the
remember
Columbine angle, right? It's like they're all just
exactly the
weirdos and yeah,
Columbine thing. And
exactly.
so I remember that was one of the things that the league liked was that I was well spoken, I was a good ambassador, I was well rounded. I brought the analogy of sports into esports, and I painted
Right.
that picture for people is that I have played basketball. I know what it feels like to be a team. I know what it feels like to, and I get that same camaraderie. I get that same drive, and I get that same sense of team and that same rush, for lack of a better way of describing it, from sports that I did from esports. And that's when I knew that it was a legitimate thing, and I wasn't going to let anyone tell me that it wasn't. And I advocated very, very hard. A, that it was a sport. B, that it wasn't just a bunch of introverted people with dysfunctional
Yes.
personality characteristics. And C, that this was a group of talented people more so than just one person, and that eventually as this grew, it would tell that story, is that there were other great teams. And I never felt a vested interest in trying to tell the media that no, like Thresh is the best player in the world and he's leaps and bounds above everyone else, even though he was clearly notches ahead of other
Yeah,
people.
yeah.
But I think the margin between some of the great players, and you started to see it when immortals came in, and I think myself, I was considered to be one of the better duelers in the world at one point. And um, I just, even B2 and Reptile, I mean, some of these people, they had their own play styles, but I
Yes.
think that, Reptile proved to me that, I felt like that I, 9 times out of 10 would beat him, but, he had the ability to throw you off, and he caught me by surprise I think it was a PGL tournament. And, Immortal obviously, um, knocked out Thresh. And yeah, I mean, it's just those were the things that I think, I was kind of advocating. The gamers were normal, that it was a sport that could support more than one superstar, and that there were other
Yes.
people who were worth paying attention to. And I think that maybe I enjoyed some extra extra presence in the spotlight because I was just a different character, and I had a sports background, and I
Right.
was sort of deployed to tell that story to the media. And
Well,
I'm
one
glad
thing
that
you'll get,
I
yeah.
did.
One thing you're getting at here, which actually, yeah, I'd like to expand on a little bit, is because here's the thing, right? Even though I come from England, like as you can imagine, when you grow up, like you see American movies and stuff, so I know a lot of the like reference points that maybe people might have missed. So what I always told people is this, because even until I would say maybe like 10 years ago, mate, a lot of the media that you would talk to where they'd never really heard what esports was, they would just hear like this. Like if you went to the CPL, for example, they'd go, oh, so there's a really big tournament in Dallas and all the gamers are going to fly in and they're going to play each other. And I could tell, dude, that what they were thinking in their brain was that 80s movie, The Wizard. They
Right.
were thinking,
Yeah.
right, it's just people who've just played at home. There's no scene, there's no circuit. It's not a sport. They're just going, it's a big tournament. They go there, like the World Series of Poker, you could give the analogy. People just go there and they don't know how good they are. They enter. And then at the end, they think whoever won, so if this case it was Thresh, they think it's like, right, he was just dubbed the best gamer, but today it was a one-off thing. Like what you're kind of pointing out is, even back then, there was a scene and there was a circuit of tournaments. They might have just been LAN parties and, you knew people from other competitions. And it was kind of like, to give the analogy there, it's kind of like the tennis circuit, right? You know people in your area and on your level, and you've had your battles and, basically that's the kind of thing that the media guys didn't get, right?
No, they didn't get that at all. And, I think that was, I think that some elements of what you're talking about is definitely, the reason why we did some things. Obviously, I'm sure we'll probably talk about GGL a little bit, but
Yes.
GGL I think was one of the greatest advocates for esports in the gaming community, while simultaneously being the most misunderstood by the community, because there were reasons why the company did things that it did, to break down barriers about competition and to bring more people into the fold, and to try to develop it into more events all the time, and to give points for participating into it, and bring in the Hollywood celebrities. A lot of people thought that was just
Gimmicky or whatever,
a
yeah.
gimmicky thing,
Yes.
but it absolutely made a difference. At one of our tournaments, the digital life that we did for Ziff Davis, we had PR people, and we brought in Jessica Alba, and we got a controller in her hand.
Oh, I can imagine not get loads more media people to pay attention,
fan
right?
of gaming, and getting Snoop Dogg involved for the Hip Hop Gaming League, and aligning ourselves with the Gravity Games, which was a competitor to the X Games. And
right.
the problem was, what people saw is that it was, they looked at it like it was watering down gaming, and not keeping the focus on it. But what people needed to understand is that gaming needed to stand side by side with some of the other organizations that had already gone through some years of evolution, and to bring in, we brought in a lot of the BMX players and the motocross players,
right?
And they were watching what was going on, and they had a respect for it,
yeah.
And they were and they became advocates for it too, and so a lot of the things that I think look gimmicky with GGL, were done with the best of intentions. And the older people, because GGL was formed by Hakeem, myself, and a money guy named Ted Owen, and he knew that there was something special about video gaming, and that he saw it kind of as a sport. But Amir and I kind of gave him, the lowdown on what was going on in the actual competitive gaming world, and what was happening with the World Cyber Games, and I think that merging those two things was powerful. But at the same time too, we had to raise money. We spent a lot of money at GGL, trying to push not just esports, but I'd say gaming culture forward. A lot of the stuff that you saw with building a studio out and doing content out of the studio daily, and committing to spend the resources to do live stream video. That was where people like DJ Wheat became involved, and sort of spearheaded all of that for us, and the commitment to do play-by-play match coverage we thought was critical, because us as players, when we had someone covering us like DJ Wheat and Red Eye and Tosspot and the people, it made us feel more special, and I think that you could probably get some really interesting feedback from NBA players and professional athletes having gone through this period of COVID right now, where they're playing for cardboard cutouts in the
Sure.
stands, and they know that they're being broadcast out, to millions of people. But it's different not having that energy to feed off of. And I think that just being able to know that there were hundreds of people watching our matches that were hearing that play by play, that's where another thing that really made it sort of cement in my mind that was going to be what the format was for this, that was necessary to continue to draw in more mainstream people. And there was a balance that always had to be, and they did such a great job with it. I think that's where DJ Weed excelled the most over everyone, was that he had an ability to make the coverage compelling, to give it that, adapt that sports sort of commentation to it, but also educate and not be exclusive, not just talk to the hardcore.
Yes.
He had a great ability to bring in people who were mainstream and tease at the fact that, plant the seed in their head where they could say, hey, this actually does, it quacks like a duck. It looks, like this thing looks and feels, and it has some of those elements of being a sport. And I think that there were a lot of people who were really instrumental into driving that forward.
In the early days, if we rewind to the Quake days that we were talking about there, as you say, you started out in these other teams. I mean, you and Thresh were already in the scene. Some of the players, as you mentioned, they were basically all around, and then you made Death Row. I want to ask about that, because one of the reasons I actually thought it was quite fitting that we didn't used to call them teams, we called them clans, is because it was actually that kind of a vibe. Really, back then, aside from the Duelers, and eventually when you had the TDM competitions, a clan was more about the idea of this is just a gang of people who all like each other, and then they're going to play. So, for example, if you 1v1 players, you play the people in your team, and you can trust that guy's not going to leak stuff to the opponent, or play unfairly, or go on servers that have dodgy ping or whatever. So one of the things I want to ask about is Death Row seemed to take you seem to be one of the first clans that, on the one hand, you retained the exclusive angle, because famously, you could not anyone just join these teams. Like some of these other teams that have 40 members, mate, anyone could join. But famously, because you got the number, you had to really earn your stripes. It took Machiavelli a while to get in, and then Immortal at the end had to sort of prove he was good. But you also, at the same time, you were also pushing the idea of being a little bit more serious, right? When the first tournaments were coming, you were trying to compete and be the best, right?
Yeah, no one got into Death Row without merit, and that merit was, you had to be an exceptional gamer. You had to be part of our, you had to. I mean, there were people on Death Row that weren't the best gamers in the world, like Twisted Killer, but he was a founding member, and he was a good player in his own right. But he was such a good person, and he was so central in connecting us all together. And it wasn't purely about just having the best players in the world. It was about having, good quality people, and good quality gamers together, and people you could trust. And, there's still, I think, even though Death Row, we came together as a team, I still think that just because the team thing is different than the dueling thing. I know that there was still rivalries from within the team,
Yes.
And you can't tell me that, Scottie Pippen and Michael Jordan didn't have their things, and Shaq and Kobe had their
of
things.
Course,
And there's always, when you put people on teams that have just this incredible desire to compete, there's a team objective and a team chemistry and dynamic that goes on, but there's still individual egos and individual competition going on. The thing is, you just have to channel it in a manner which is productive for the team.
When you said earlier that, you thought of yourself, you're a pretty good dueler, and obviously in your first team, you're one of the better players, right? When you first met Thresh and you played him, right? Obviously, one of the things is he always tells the story like he almost never lost a practice. He was just beating everyone 100% of the time. We're like, was he someone? Did you ever beat him? Was it competitive when you played him? I mean, the fact that you're from the same area, did you even know he was supposed to be the best player? Because I've often wondered, maybe some of you guys, you were like, fuck, if this guy locally can beat me, am I even that good? But it's like turned out he was actually the best in the world or whatever.
Yeah, I missed the Doom. I missed the Doom era. So I think I heard of Thresh through other people, and just and I think again, Twisted Killer was sort of the one who kind of like he had his eyes on who the better players were in the community, and the best players were in the community. And he was the town crier for esports to some degree, or like would be like our player personnel scouting sort of person. I guess would be how you would say it, but um, it was really hard to know when. So the thing about Legends is they had an office up in the Bay Area, and back in the Quake days, you could in netQuake you could look up people's IP addresses that were playing.
Right.
But if you've been studied networking for 5 minutes, you know that you can change the IPs on a network. And I think that the LGD people, the Legends people were, it was the belief that people were kind of cycling IPs and were always under alias, and you never knew who you were playing. And if you did beat someone online, they would be like, "Hi, it's Pookie."
They could deny it, right? Okay,
yeah. And it's like that. Well, I know how Pookie plays, and I know how you play. And there were suspicions that I think Dennis got a lot of practice against other people, sort of under alias.
He was sort of smurfing until he was ready to reveal that it was an official match, basically.
Yeah,
right.
And I was very different. I liked to have my name out there at all times,
Right.
and didn't always work out for me,
Sure.
but again, that kind of tied into the thing is that, hey, let's be honest here, that there is a group of people that can all beat each other. I had got my ass kicked on LAN a couple times, and I have my excuses for why it happened, but ultimately I have to own that, and but yeah, though there was I think it was hard to know, even when Dennis and I were teammates, I think that we only scrimmaged one-on-one against each other maybe 2 or 3 times.
Okay.
And I think that there was probably always, that was probably intentional, so that there was always, he kind of had that advantage over me, I think, in the dueling side of things, is that he probably played people more, and there was less information out there about him, but we all kind of knew Dennis's style. We could kind of, if you were good enough, you could pick it apart. I mean, the dude had the best rockets that I've ever seen. I'll never forget playing my one-on-one match against him in the PGL. It was frustrating because someone was using my own tactics against me, and that was not something that I had ever really experienced before, where, normally I could exert my will over someone and just, my skill level allowed me to get away with a little bit more, but with Dennis, it was harder. And there were issues, I think, that plagued the esports community back in those days. We were just happy to get tournaments organized, and we were just happy to have these sponsors involved, and we weren't playing on very good machines in the tournaments a lot of the time, and so it was difficult, especially for me. I feel like I had one of the best lightning guns in netQuake. Mike J will even admit to that if I think if you ask him. But when you
needed a very good PC basically for the lightning gun, right? You need like the FPS to be good, etc.
You needed to be dialed in, and it didn't. The lightning gun didn't suit people who were Excel rocketers, I think, at the time, and but if you go from playing on a 80 frames per second machine, and then your tournament machines are getting 30 to 45, your lightning gun's not going to perform like it should on LAN. So there were issues in esports, with equipment, and I think that the people who play nowadays, they take for granted the fact that they're playing on these uniform systems and very high quality hardware, and we're Moore's law is somewhere back there nowadays.
Yes.
and you don't have to upgrade your computer every 6 months like you did back in those days, and I think that if some of the pros of today, I know that they say that, oh, there were so few of you playing back then and this or that. There's a little bit of a lack of respect for the early generation people.
There's
and
different challenges, right?
different challenges, but I mean, I think if you stuck, some of the Overwatch pros on the equipment we were using back in the day, and on our, CRTs and crappy LCDs when they
With ball
started to
mouse,
adopt to
everything.
that, and ball mouse,
Yes.
and yeah, I think that it's no different than looking back at the NBA from 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago and being like, oh, Shaq would have kicked Wilt Chamberlain's
Sure.
ass. And Wilt Chamberlain was a foot taller than everyone else that he played against. And there was no goaltending rules. And, in tennis, they were playing with, rackets that were strung to be a certain way and with small racket heads. And they
Yes.
didn't get the type of acceleration. And the technology around sports is always, pushing forward. And then, people are serving at 150 miles an hour now. And, would Rod Laver, still be one of the best tennis players, if he was playing against, Novak Djokovic and some of these players today? Maybe not, but you know what? Everyone laid their bricks in the foundation that got it to the point where it was even able to develop to that
Sure.
point. So I sort of view our generation as, not quite the peach basket era of esports. I would sort of give that to maybe like the Twin Galaxies arcade,
Right. The old school, yes.
sort of guys, and the fighting gamers and that stuff. But as far as with the technology that we had to work with and the connections we had to work with, and a T1 connection cost about $2,000 or $3,000 a month to have, and it was 1.4 megabit up and down. So it was very difficult to just have a stable gaming environment that translated to a stable environment. I mean, for Christ's sakes, when I competed in the Quake 2 CPL event, I had been playing on a modem for a year and a half, waiting for cable modem connection up in San Francisco. And, I was still one of the best Quake 2 players. I think I got to the winner's bracket final and ended up losing to Ricks, which knocked me down into the loser's bracket final. But, I came from playing a modem, on being, 140 ping modem player. And when I got to LAN, it was amazing. I could, all my weapon play and everything else was so much better. But one thing, if you go from not playing in a low ping environment to, if you're in a medium or high ping environment and you go to playing on a low ping environment in those games, was your movement was a nightmare, and it was a mess. I couldn't do simple double jumping to get armors, let alone, the circle jumps necessary to get to the mega health, and without being able to run those routes. And I still, I had the map in control, and to lose because of, simple getting stuck on boxes when I'm jumping because of different latency issues, like it really broke my spirit as an esports player, is that, like, to lose a tournament in that manner. No, not taking anything away from Dan. He's
Sure. Yeah.
one of the best players, but it was a difficult climate to play, to compete in back then, both to train, and to then make sure that you basically was a roll of the dice of what your tournament machines were going to be like and experience, what you were going to play under, what sort of circumstances. So
a player actually I want to ask about from Death Row, because listen, people know the big names, Machiavelli, Thresh, Immortal, etc. But one that actually often is very unknown is actually B2. And I heard that the story from talking to the other guys was something like that he was actually super duper good, but didn't he have to, he had RSI or something, and so he sort of just tapped out early or something? Wasn't it something along those lines?
What is RSI?
It's like wrist injury, or some sort of was it something along those lines?
I don't know if he got carpal tunnel or not, or some sort of wrist injury. He might have. Yeah, I'm not sure.
I could be making that up. I'm not sure, but
I know that he, all of our, we sort of hit a fork in the road in our careers, in midway through all of our gaming. But, I know that those guys were working on gamers.com, and people were sort of transitioning into careers. But no, I mean, there's no question that B2 was, I'd say, Dennis's protege, and probably his probably most competitive practice partner that he had, as far as from the Northern California guys. I think that when Dennis was training for a tournament, I think he and B2 were probably doing the fatality thing and playing for hours at a time, and staying sharp that way. But Yeah, B2 was a phenomenal player, and I think that he just may not have had as much of a killer instinct, as far as like Thresh's killer instinct was off the charts. I think that my killer instinct was pretty close to it. Immortal's killer instinct was off the charts, but yeah, B2 is a great player in his own right. And one of those guys that I think that on any given day could be hot and take a tournament from you.
By the way, since you referenced Fatality there, I remember actually in the era, this is when esports was already well and going. I remember there was an episode, I think it was Live on 3 with DJ Wheat's call-in show where they had Fatality. And Fatality, it was where they had like Fatality and Thresh come on together or something. And obviously for people who were like fans of gaming, like they didn't have overlapping careers because Fatality was Quake 3 and Thresh was Quake 2 and Quake 1. And Fatality told a story where he like was on trial or was trying to get into death row when he was like a 16-year-old kid or something crazy like back in Quake. Like was he around the scene actually? Was he really just like some snot-nosed brat before becoming a great player?
They were all snot
right.
Machiavelli was, Immortal was, Fatality was. I think that Death Row was sort of rose to prominence as the first real sponsored, globally recognized esports team and brand in gaming. And I think that we were, I don't want to say role models, but we were examples. And I think that these guys inspired to break into the scene, and they all did in their own rights. Fatality was definitely around. I was very close with him. He actually lived with my brother, my older brother, for a while, and learned how to. My brother taught him how to surf, and we used to LAN like crazy. And when John was honing, I think that like single-handedly, I witnessed John develop that practice mentality because we used to play 1,000 health in Quake 3, and I was very cocky, just like John is very cocky, just like Thresh is very cocky, and I would be like, I'm just going to use rail only against this guy, and he'd get very, very frustrated, and he'd be using perfect weapons, and we would spar for hours and hours and hours at a time, and it was clear early on that he was going to be a special gamer, and that his approach to it, like he was all in on practicing, more. And I think that people kind of gave him, there was almost like people would kind of, it was a dig for some people that like, oh wow, like
they used to make fun of him like he was a tryharder. Yeah,
like a tryhard, exactly. But it just goes to show you like who has the
certainly his legacy kind of made everyone shut up, right?
Speaks for itself, absolutely. And I think that that's something that every player who's serious about getting, and it's not like we all didn't play an unhealthy amount of gaming. I think John also played similarly or more than that, but I think that it was his structure, and he would get people and he would play, he would do that same intensive training that I know that a lot of players do nowadays. There's a whole regimen for how you prepare for a tournament, and how you prepare for these events. But I think John really started to almost, turn it into a science.
Sure. When you were in Death Row, and obviously like you had the first online tournaments, like the clan tournaments.
To answer your question, I'm sorry, I don't know if if there was ever really a formal tryout or anything, and he obviously never was like denied. I just don't think, I think around the time that he was doing that, obviously there was a transition of Death Row into Clan 9 US, and Death Row sort of, I don't want to say dissolved, but kind of everyone kind of became casual as right. Again, they were like, I think some of our esports careers were put on pause, and we tried to go into the business and entrepreneurial, spirits sort of said, at least for me, I looked at it and was like, I'm really, enjoying gaming and stuff like this, but like Hakeem and I, when we met early on, he was still involved in Excess Reality. Yes, Reality.
Yeah, it was Excess Reality at the time. Yeah, they changed it later.
And Sujoy and him and a handful of others, the Europeans. When I met him, our sort of mission when Amir and I met, and he ended up, living with me and becoming part of my family basically for a year and a half, and really close with my parents. And he and I set off to sort of like take that esports community and develop something in the United States. And we were talking with Battletop Korea at that time and Battletop USA. I don't know if you remember those companies.
Yeah, they were the qualifiers for the World Cyber Games.
Right. Yeah. And so Battletop USA, their sort of funding, I think, got rolled back a little bit, pulled back from Korea. And but Amir and I were doing a lot of like M&A, looking into the M&A market and biz dev and trying to raise money. And that's sort of around the time period when we met the other principal in GGL, and Thresh actually introduced us to him, to Ted Owen, who ended up becoming the money guy and sort of the older CEO of GGL, and that's kind of how we got involved with that. But Amir and I were definitely looking at how to maybe expand Excess Reality into the US market, and that was still the .com boom
Yes.
was going on, and that was why I dropped out of Berkeley, which I had transferred to sort of, I was still competing at the time then, but also the business things were starting to happen at the same time. And it was clear that we were going to, this entrepreneurial spirit had sort of lit in us, and that we wanted to try to do what we could do to turn this into a professional sport. I think we all would have loved to continue competing, but the mission for all of us was to help esports develop into a professional sport.
On the team side, one of the most famous, on one level, publicity events was when you did the Clan 9 versus Death Row, and you went over to Sweden to play at the time the best European team. But if people don't know, unfortunately, I will fill in, because people might look it up now, look up the score and see like, they wiped the floor with you. But I have to say a couple of pieces of context. One, the problem was the two different regions played different games. Obviously, we played Quake World in Europe. You guys played netQuake, so you played half the games in each. But there were slight differences like the movement and stuff. And then the other detail is, I believe most of you already, because if you're playing the Duel and PGL, had already switched to Quake 2, and then he switched back, whereas famously in Europe, most of the Quake 1 and Quake 2 players were only ever united in Quake 3. Like, often they're separate scenes, we didn't have like transition between, because it wasn't about being a pro as much, it was just, you were just a good player in the game you liked. So was this more of like an exhibition game to you? Was it serious competition? How would you describe it?
Yeah, Death Row had gone through a lot of fatigue at that point. I think we had played for we had been competing for 2 or 3 years and hadn't lost a match, which is kind of an amazing, an actual tournament match. And, say what you will about the state of the gaming community at the time. It was, we were, to some degree, we were kind of like the dream team, of early on in Quake. Not to say that there weren't great teams like U4 and Clan Capital and Clan Gib and a bunch of other Postal. But, I mean, the dentist factor was huge. Having the best player in the game usually ends up, giving you a leg up on people. But we had some really kick-ass players. And for whatever reason, we did really well. And we had built enough confidence that it steamrolled into what I think is really a really interesting part of esports' history, which is, this undefeated legacy and sort of tournament play. And then, like you said, people were fracturing off. I think people were trying to figure out how to make money, and work jobs, and some people were in school and transition to other games. But I know that the Clan 9 thing had been in development for a while, and they had been talking to us about for a while, and they were like, we'd like to invite you to come out to Sweden to play an exhibition and pay for it. And I mean, we were just like, that is like the coolest thing in the world to go out there and play. And I would say that we were definitely not, anywhere near where we were in our prime. We were out of practice. Clan 9 had done a ton of, demo mining and analysis on us, and we almost didn't even know who these guys were. There was very little material that was out there. And the difference between Quake World and Quake was not to be discounted at that time. It was like, for us people that were playing basketball, it was like playing basketball with a soccer ball. The physics were different. The movement was different. There was different tricks to the movement. The strafe running was different, and there were just things. Especially the thing that was the most jarring was the physics behind it. Like, I always felt like I called netQuake the purest form of Quake because, I understand why Quake World was important because it expanded the player base and allowed more people to have a chance to play and to even the playing field. But that was at the expense of the fidelity of the competition experience. And when you were on, you know, when you got hit by a rocket in Quake World, it was like it might have been a tactical nuclear bomb. Like,
Right.
you got shot to the ceiling, and then when you got shot again, there was no way in Quake World, in netQuake, you could fight through a direct rocket. You could fight
Right.
through getting thrown to the ceiling. And I remember Dennis and I played Thousand Health a few times up in the Thousand Health training up in his office in the Bay Area. And when I look back on it, it was like watching two great players do that in netQuake was like watching some weird combination of like ballet and poetry, like like just people both smacking each other, throwing them both across the map, and then both hitting direct rockets and the things that you could do. But like in Quake World, if you got hit by a rocket, it was like the acceleration from which you were slammed and pinned to the ceiling was just ridiculous, and there were just you could not. The combat in the game was just totally different, and I thought it was a shame because it took away from the ability for good players to have that nuance of competition. Because whenever you're like this close in skill separates you from someone else, the ability to fight and hit directs and fight through the rocket splash and the shaft and like, you know, all that was lost, I think, with the physics that were in Quake World, and it was a shame. And I can't expect people who only played Quake World to understand it, but netQuake was definitely a more clean. I would say, the sort of perfect Quake experience if you were on LAN.
Okay. Since you were a guy who came up in, as you said, Quake, like you weren't the Doom era, you were in Quake. When they had Quake 2, which was, funnily enough, it sounds, when you talk about these games, like these were like decades, like Quake 2 was only a couple of years because Quake 3 was right afterwards, that's how quickly games came out. When Quake 2 came out, how did that compare for you to Quake? Like, was it one of those ones where I know some people like didn't like the railgun or whatever? Did you like it as much as a game? Did you take to it as well as you did to Quake?
I did. I don't and I think that I was very good at it. I don't know how good I could have became at it because of the whole modem situation that I was stuck on and being sort of isolated out in the Bay Area and not being, I didn't have that office in Los Angeles to compete with, all these people all the time. But um, I I do think Quake 2 was a great game. I don't think it was as good as Quake 1. I don't know that any of the Quakes were as good as Quake 1. Although I do love all of them for different reasons. I think the introduction of the railgun, for better or worse, was one of the most interesting elements of
Sure.
of Quake 2. And I was always, and you talked to Machiavelli about this, is I told him, and he knew it was my mantra, is like sometimes you got to go for the Hollywood shots and the Hollywood plays, and you've got to
Right. You
go
just
for
got to go for
broke.
the home run, as it were.
Sometimes you got to go for broke, not only to
Yes.
win, but also just because, like da 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 da
Yeah. Of
ESPN,
course.
and that was my probably my biggest weakness in my game is that to I like to remove that element of my mind from my element of my gameplay, and I really kind of played on instinct. And I think my instinct was very, very aggressive, and a lot of times it worked out, and a lot of times it didn't. And I think that the railgun was the ultimate temptation for someone like me and
Right.
someone like Machiavelli and someone like Immortal who, had a very, very honed skill and ability to just have ridiculous aim and pull off
Yes.
ridiculous shit with those guns. And, rather it's you see it all the time even in Quake Champions when you pop someone in the air and someone goes with a rail instead of a lightning gun, and it's like you're in Quake 2 would have been the chain gun, but it's like there are just do's and don'ts for competitive play now because the skill level is so high that like
Sure.
you don't see that really often except from the big balls guys like 04 did it a lot. CZM, I
Sure.
remember playing, CZM came to the GGL offices when we were still gaming a lot from the GGL offices. I remember him watching me play. We were playing like LAN scrimmages with like, some of the best players and, most historical figures in Quake.
Right.
And I remember CZM sort of pulling me aside and he goes, and I was a entrepreneur and a co-founder of a startup at this point. So my gaming skills and days were shifting away from that. But he looked at me and he goes, you can win tournaments with that rail. Like, and which is quite a compliment coming from the guy who became one of the, one of the most robotic, arguably
one of the best rails of all time,
cyborg railers of all time. So I think that was one of the most special things about Quake is, like you said, that these games had relatively quick turnover, and some people excelled more at Quake 2 than they did at Quake 1, and then some people excelled more at Quake 3, and then we start to see, like esports really starting to develop through Counter-Strike and all that stuff. But it was really awesome to see the generations develop after us, the fatalities, the CZMs, the 0-4s. I mean, these were all people, we were all hanging out in our IRC channel together, which is, a Discord is a glorified and,
in a
better
way,
featured IRC. And if I wasn't playing so many goddamn games, I probably would have come up with something like this myself. But really cool, awesome community that developed, and I don't really go into retrospect like this, so I'm really grateful for this interview because esports was such a big part of my life, and there's so many great memories and so many things that I'm fond of, and I try to evaluate my position in it, and I feel really good about what I did both as a player and as a contributor to the growth of esports. But it's really humbling to think about where it is now, and how that legacy of players really did come out of that era, and the Counter-Strike players. And that was one of the things that I thought was really like important about what we did with GGL, is that we tried to say that there are way more talented players than just the 1 or 2 stars, but here are the 1 or 2 stars that you should be speaking to about this and that have the best media training. But let's put the StarCraft players alongside the UT players and the Quake players and the Counter-Strike players, although that was a little bit harder of a community for us to get access to, because like it was kind of embargoed by the CPL and embargoed by organizations like GotFrag. And but there were some really good people that were involved that helped us, incorporate that in. And I think that was really great to see talented players across different games and even across different genres be appreciated for the different skills that were important in those games. And it all came down to concentration and practice and commitment. And then some people had the raw skill factor, that was the coefficient of like, their gaming style. But yeah, no, that was really great to see those people start to coexist. I'm just really cool. It's really cool. And I'm really happy to see how gaming evolved and came out, and how the communities came together and had mutual respect across games. And obviously we played across games with each other, but yeah, it's really nice to reminisce on this stuff.
One thing you touched on there, I want to go back to, because I think like people, I know what you mean by it, but I think people might not know when you're touching it there. When you said about how you always kind of went for like the big home run shot, the haymaker, as it were, the shot that like the fans would want to see, basically. Like it's like going for like a contested 3 in basketball. Yeah, you could go by the guy and get an easy layup.
I used to say to Machiavelli when he was coming up, was sometimes you just got to go Hollywood, man.
There you go.
Sometimes you just got to go Hollywood.
But when you say that, though, like the problem with that style is, though, it's fantastic to watch when someone's on their game, but it's not the style that's going to win the tournament. Because if you notice, right, if you look at people like Thresh and Fatality, one of the things they figured out sort of was when you could play conservatively and just kind of like grind the... Like if you think of the tennis analogy, just grind a guy out. Don't go for the big serve or the passing shot. Just keep hitting it back to him, as it were. Just let him make a mistake. So I can imagine in that sense, if you raw aim was very good, because obviously Machiavelli and Immortal had the same issue. If they were on in a game, they could beat anyone. But this is the reason why Thresh would probably beat them most times. So this it's different.
Tell that I'll push back on that a little bit and say tell that to Steph Curry in the NBA, who shoots threes from 35 feet. And some games he'll hit 12 of them in a row, and he does them more often than not. And that's how you go from ending up on SportsCenter to becoming something of legacy, and I think that I think you see that with some of the great tennis players that used to, return crazy shots between their legs,
Right.
and they had a tendency of trying to hit that 130 mile an hour second serve, and yeah, it definitely doesn't work out all the time if you're consistently going to play the safe style. Um, I think that that's definitely the approach that you take. Is not take calculated risks when they make sense. And
Right.
I still think that that's fundamentally, a sound and good advice for players to take. But, when you're a young kid playing basketball, you spend a lot of your time heaving half court shots at the basket
Okay.
because
Sure.
that's when you're like, because it's happened 4 times in NBA history where someone's won a finals game because they hit a half court shot,
Sure.
and that's what everyone wants that's competing as a professional player, is that adrenaline and that glory and that doing it for your fans and doing it for history, and I think that sports oftentimes is like really weird thing that's tapped into the universe, that like it gives you opportunities to do that a lot.
Right.
And I don't know if you remember, but yeah, Kobe Bryant, is famously known in his early years for
The airballs, right?
airballing shots,
Yes.
and
Yes.
but what that did was channel him to work harder and refine his game, and he never became gun shy, that guy. And
Sure.
he was ridiculed for it, but he also, I think, till this day, still has the highest percentage of game-winning shots and I think that that's why I liked him so much, is because, and Jordan was not shy to take really crazily contested game-winning shots. And it's because he believed that he had a better shot, or he had the responsibility of taking the game on his shoulders and doing that. But yeah, I think especially for one-on-one dueling, you want to limit the amount of risk that you take. But I think at the same time too, you need to have the personality behind the way that you play, because that goes into demoralizing your opponent, and that was half the time that we did what we did, was hit rails when we didn't need to, or not take the easy shots, because it was like throwing up a middle finger to your opponent and being like, I'm better than you,
Right.
and I'm going to exert my will however I damn well please when I play you. But there were players that you couldn't do that against, or that took advantage of that, and Dennis was one of the best at doing that. And although I didn't play Fatality too much in non-practice training settings, he was very good at doing that too.
Well, one thing you touched on there, we should definitely bring out, is one thing, and listen, this is also like a West Coast culture thing, is people on the West Coast like to talk some shit, like when they played, especially if you come from a basketball background. I mean, it's just mental if you go on the playgrounds there. So you were one of the players, right? Give us some thoughts on this, because people might know maybe from Machiavelli later, because he kind of did it in Quake 3, and there was a little bit more media attention, but it was kind of a thing back then, right? So how much were you into
Definitely a thing, and I think a lot of it was driven just, in the mid 90s. I think that, we were all very much into hip hop culture, and, there was an East West Coast Tupac Biggie thing, and I think that that sort of, because we listened to that, we felt like we were a part of that, and we were 17, 18-year-old kids listening to those artists. And I think that that naturally, especially with Death Row and Unforgiven, and Clan Gibb and Clan Capital, I remember I ended up meeting a girl that I dated, that I met at the E3, one of the E3 events, and it wasn't, in hindsight, it wasn't the best thing for my gaming career, but it was there's a little bit of controversy behind that, but we won't touch on that. But I think the East Coast West Coast thing, I remember meeting him through her. I think it was it Ron Bob? Gunpowder. It was Clan Gibb. It was Gunpowder, and he lived in Virginia, and I was out in Virginia at the time. And I remember I got invited to come over to one of the Clan Gibb, Clan Capital lands, and I walked through the door, and like the only thing missing was a record skip. It was like,
right? Okay.
like, what's this Death
You're
Row
notorious
dude doing? And that was, I think, one of the interesting things, because I had that shit talking persona, but I was still a nice guy. but don't challenge me in a game that I believe that I'm one of the best in the world in, and expect to come out of it, without bruises and scrapes and cuts and gashes, verbally and did in the game. I was gonna, and one of the things that I always said is, you can talk all the shit that you want, but I'm gonna do my talking with my mouse and my keyboard. So when we play, you'll know. And I remember walking into that LAN, and there was a guy who was particularly outspoken in the East Coast. His name was APOC, and we set up to play a LAN in person, and everyone was like, "Whoa, this is going to be crazy." And it was a very intense environment going in there. But because I was in there with Gunpowder, as his guest, and I don't know whose house it was, but we had a LAN party, and they set me up on a bar stool, and I was playing on someone else's computer without the right mouse drivers.
They're trying to hinder you.
Sound drivers weren't even working, so I didn't have sound. And APOC and I played, and he was a big online shit talker. And let's just say that, but I don't know if it was in the negatives, but if not, it was close.
You dusted him off?
Yeah, sitting on a bar stool with no proper mouse drivers and no sound, so there was definitely a rivalry, and there was definitely an East versus West thing. And I think that, it was kind of fleeting and in the moment. And, kind of the analogy that you see in sports is, when they're on the field, your enemies, and short of, causing people permanent, physiological damage, like breaking their neck and doing this or that. Like, that goes back to the point of me looking at Dennis's hand on the ground and be like, "Oh, I should step on that. That'll give me a better chance of winning the Ferrari." I would never do that. But the fact that thought, jokingly entered into my mind, is just goes to show you like how competitive, people are in the space. But when all was said and done, we were a brotherhood, and we were a tight-knit community, and we knew that we needed to have mutual respect for each other in order to legitimize what we were doing.
As you've alluded to many times, obviously you then later, after being a pro gamer, you did the GGL thing where you were trying to set up companies and build the first big esports things. And so when you did GGL and you had all these different tournaments and online component, this was actually the era where, as from some of the names that you've mentioned, people might guess, games like Quake were starting to unfortunately go into the rear view mirror. Now, it was about Counter-Strike, and it was other games basically kind of took over, and they had their own ethos and their own tournaments and all the rest of it. What do you think about the fact that kind of like, even to this day, there are versions of Quake and there's still a very hardcore community? It's even a lot of the same players that have been on for the last 10, 15 years. But that is, like, if you look at the biggest esports games, they've gone more towards the casual audience. They've embraced that, sheer numbers. Do you look back wistfully on the days when it was pure 1v1 and it was this kind of hardcore competition?
Yeah, we spent a lot of money at GGL. Broadening the base of esports, and there was no financial reason to keep supporting the arena shooters, especially with like Counter-Strike and some of these other larger audience games, StarCraft, but it still wasn't. I think now it's safe to say that arena shooters are always going to be plagued by not having a difficulty in adoption. I do think that arena shooters, hands down, are the most competitive, and they demonstrate the most skill of any games that are played. Particularly, like the Quake series of games. I think that Diabolical, like, I love the game, and it pains me to see that the community, is not as big as it is. And I don't know where they are in their marketing and what their plans are. I don't want to say that it's, I think it's a fantastic game, and I haven't had that much fun playing it's
kind of the spiritual successor to Quake, right? It feels like
spiritual successor to Quake, 100%. Yes. And kudos to them for doing that. And I guess what I'm trying to communicate is that we would never ever, because Hakeem and I were our legacy was in Quake, and Unreal Tournament, I consider they were great players in that too. And it was the brother of Quake, and Clippy B was a great guy, and it had that purebred, no holds barred arena, shooter, brutal gameplay design. But we continued to pour money into Quake and give it equal prominence, and to try to grow it and give it as much opportunity. I think it lended itself the best for commentary, and I think that it demonstrated the craziest amount of skill.
Yes.
Like I think it takes a lot of education and experience to watch someone laning in League of Legends and know like, oh my God, that skill shot they hit was insane. Like, that in eyes camera view of someone playing. And when we were working a lot with production in GGL, which, Marcus was obviously spearheading, and
Sure.
when we were turning shoutcasting into into a video product from just an audio product. And basically, I think that, you'd have to credit GGL with really being the first to define what that product and how that traditional like video sports broadcast looked for esports coverage. I think that we were trying to work with overlays that brought stats and data in,
Right.
at the same time, and we were pushing the bleeding edge of our ability and pouring a lot of money into it. But I do think that arena shooters were the best to demonstrate, raw skill, and something that I, was hoping that the rest of the world would be able to adopt. But I don't think unless you've like, flipped a 180 and hit a snap rail and then or hit a prediction rocket, and just to know what's going through a pro player's head. They said that Dennis had ESP, and any great player did. They, the four-dimensional chess that was going on in the background of our head of like, I know that he knows that I know that he knows that I know. And by then, you've already made your decision subconsciously.
Sure.
And, and like you throw a rocket down a hallway and hear it's like, all right. Yeah. Like that was, and I think that, that a lot of that is just, I think any human thing that you do over and over again, it's about doing it and repeating it so much and training muscle memory in the right way, so that you have all the technical ability to do stuff. But that ESP thing is something that I think just comes with mastery, and some people have a better sense of it and some people don't. And some people are way more cerebral when they play than they don't. I was a little less cerebral and a little bit more on instinct. And I think Dennis was a little bit more cerebral and, a little bit less on instinct, probably. I think his stuff was more deliberate. But yeah, no, I always thought the arena shooters were the most fascinating and most purest form of esports. And that's why I was really, really drawn to the Overwatch League. But there's just so much going on with Overwatch and like, that MOBA-esque, like crazy graphics and, it was almost impossible for me to follow. And I had
It's kind of got a lot of signal noise, hasn't it? It's like a lot going on the screen.
Signal noise, man.
Yeah.
And, really hard to commentate through that. And, but yeah, I think arena games continue to struggle in adoption these days and in spectator viewership. But I do believe that once someone figures out how to do it correctly, I think that they'll be regarded as the most highest skill cap form of esports, especially dueling.
This might sound like a little bit of an out there question, but I'll throw it out there for you. Mm-hmm. So when you were doing the death row experiment, like I said, people like Machiavelli, you alluded to it before, Machiavelli and Immortal came along basically right at the end of Quake 1, and they were like the young kids, and they were wanting to be in this cool team and stuff. And then Quake 2, they were the competitors with you at the tournaments. When Quake 3 came along and you were moving into the business angle and you were doing other things, I remember when GGL was first set up, one of the things you did actually in the media world was you tried to make this little series where Immortal was going to do his comeback. I think it was maybe to play maybe Doom or something. He was coming back to play. I can't remember. Maybe it was Quake 3.
Who was going to make their comeback?
Immortal.
Oh, yeah.
And so one thing I wanted to ask was this.
Yeah, I forgot about that. Jeez.
Unlike people like Thresh and some of the other Machiavelli who had a couple of years where they actually tried to play like a pro, like I'll practice properly, I go to this LAN. Mm-hmm. One of the problems with Immortal was he was just someone, by all accounts, just a very talented player. And he just, it was the young kids mentality of like, I'm just playing because it's fun. And so it sounds like when he tapped out and he did this little mini comeback, like, if he'd have had the kind of fatality mentality, I think to myself, considering he was such a young guy and he had this very crazy personality, he could have been the big superstar name, right? If he'd have been marketed right and he'd had that mentality right.
Yeah, he had probably the most raw skill. His aim is still incredible to this day. We played a lot of Apex Legends, a year or so ago, and he's fearless. His aim is impeccable. His confidence and cockiness is off the charts.
He's still shit talking.
No, you're not. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. He is. But yeah, no. I mean, I think that if anyone, his skill has probably stuck around, and lasted the test of time. Whenever he's playing, well, and Dennis obviously too. Dennis still is great. We played PUBG. Those guys played a lot more than I did, but Dennis is still top notch. I do think that you know a lot of these old players, if they really, really, probably stuck our families and wives and stuff on desert islands and quit our jobs and went to. That's why I was talking for a while, or there was a rumor floating around that Twitch was thinking about doing like an old timer gaming house and like
Right.
wiring it up for reality series. And I do think that the old school gamers definitely still can compete. I don't know at what level, and it would take a lot of practice, but I know that muscle memory is still there. I do believe, especially Immortal would have a chance in competing.
I Since, as you've alluded to, obviously you've been playing some games still. Are you
Hmm.
someone where is there any way in which, like in esports, you would make some kind of a comeback? It doesn't have to be as a player. Like, do you still want to be involved, like on the industry level? Like, have you done some smaller projects recently? Like, what's your status in that regard?
Yeah, I've been playing. I kind of when Quake Champions came out, I wanted to sort of at least bring my um, I wanted to bring the history of who I was back in. I knew I was going to get clobbered, and I wasn't practicing. I was like, "Hey, there's an open spot. You want to play? Matches in 3 days." And I'm like, "Oh my god, I don't even know how the player movement works, with these characters and stuff like that." But I wanted to be in the community and to try and to just compete. Um, I do. I mean, I would love to compete in the games that I play. Like I play a lot of like Heroes of the Storm, just because I
Oh, okay.
love Blizzard games, and I played World of Warcraft for so long, which probably also messed up my pro gaming career a little bit. But um, I think that Vic and I play hot sometimes, and we kind of joke about it. It's like this is esports bingo, we call it. Because it's like a little bit of competition, but like it's like where the old esports pros will go to
All right, I see.
play
I get the
bingo
analogy
and
now. There.
play bingo and retire and drink orange sure and die one day. It's like where you send old esports pros out to pasture is kind of in that setting, and we joke around a lot about that. But I've done some things in the industry. I thought for a while about maybe doing some stuff with Blizzard. I went through a series of interviews with them to maybe be involved in Heroes of the Storm and do some in like a director of esports sort of capacity. I don't remember what the title was I was interviewing for, but ultimately it didn't happen for whatever reason. But esports has been a really mixed bag for me. I think my career in esports, I felt like I sacrificed a lot of it to kind of do what I felt was more important, which was help build GGL and really take a shot at creating a gaming league and a community, and to bring a community together and to push the production value behind it, and to continue advocating with the media, and to make investments and capital investments, to um, do the Hollywood style events, to break down the barriers with the media. And we made a lot of dumb decisions on the way, or I guess I wouldn't call them dumb decisions, but there was not parity between, like there were young co-founders in GGL, and then there were older co-founders.
Right.
And I think that, the younger co-founders like Amir and myself, we were on the front lines every day working with the people who were building the technology and running the tournaments and doing this. And the senior team was supporting the company more with, endless fundraising, which was very challenging in a time when, we were still fighting these stigmas about esports. But, um, just there are certain decisions that were made. Like one great example is GGL got a lot of ridicule for using the term V Sports instead of esports, and it was there were a lot of reasons why that decision was made. In the mid 2000s, if you were in the tech space, you were basically just inundated. And I think Apple, started this trend of the iMac and the
Right.
iThis and
Okay.
eHarmony and eThis. And it was like, oh my God, Christ, guys, really, you want to call this esports? Like, this is, people are laughing about this. Like, let's be a little bit, let's not be the next casualty of that, oversaturized
Okay.
marketing, thing of which calling it esports. And so, but at the same time too, if it was important to the community, but I mean, there was a collective groan against from the gamers that were in the office, especially the people that were involved in technology, that were like, esports, really? Like e hyphen or e,
Right. I
however,
see.
however, Red Eye and the and the people that are out there formed a committee to go out there and make sure that any
Sure.
use of the word in
Yes.
any other format is expunged and people who use it are ridiculed. But the I think a lot of the thinking behind that was what's most palpable to the media and what translates best to the media, and what will, meanwhile, at the same time, Ted Owen of GGL had this dream of elevating esports into be, an electronic sport at the Olympics. And so what was the best way to package that? Was it, more like virtual sports? And we saw that VR could eventually become, something that was in that, that played a part in that. So that was kind of the reason why the decision was made to use V Sports. But there was, pretty much all the hardcore gamers pushed back against it. But like, you can only fight your battles so long with people internally that, we felt like it was okay to just do that. But I think that people throw a lot of barbs about that decision, but they don't really have the context behind it, which is that, we felt it was a much more effective way of communicating to the press. We thought that virtual sports was much more inclusive of a broader range of sports, especially ones when you have like football and soccer. FIFA event became huge and Madden became huge,
Right.
and I thought that was a better way of communicating it to the mainstream, or there was at least a compelling enough argument of why it should be done. So that was why we ended up doing it. But and we had an event called the V Sports All Stars where, you know, we invited some of the best players from across
Yeah.
about eight,
Sure.
eight different games and flew them to E3 and made a showcase out of it and did coverage of it and commentation and, elevated it and put it in front of a lot of people. And, whether it has a V in front of it or an E in front of it, I'm proud as hell of, what we were trying to do to break down barriers for esports in the mainstream.
Okay. I mean, maybe you touched on a lot of there, but at the end of the interview, do you have like a final message or any people you want to shout out, say hello to if they're watching?
Well, geez, put me on the spot here. I mean, obviously, Carmack, I miss hearing his crazy voice, and even though my ability to sort of replicate his drolling Polish accent
It's not
is
bad.
not as bad,
You're doing a
not
good
as
one.
good as
Yeah.
it used to be. Shout out to DJ Wheat always, all the people that worked at GGL, that gave many, many years of their lives in very hectic and crazy and this environment of people who were dreaming and had this dream to elevate esports to the mainstream, and we all contributed different pieces of it. And I just would encourage them to say that for the faults that the company had and for the failures in leadership and some of the blemishes on the company, like the unfortunate way that things split with clan base. But when a company is running out of money and dying, guys, bad things happen.
Sure.
And I never really understood the pressures that our senior team had to go through until I left and started my own company and ran into money problems and was like, okay, I can kind of understand why they were beholden to shareholders and trying to keep the company alive. But just shout out to everyone, Hogan, Chachi, Corey, Noonan. I mean, you guys all know who you are. The wild, crazy things that we did with esports. We were ahead of our time, and I know that people don't always look back on it, and they don't always give it, credibility, or it's the place that I think it deserves in the history and timeline of esports. But I'll never forget what you guys did and how hard you worked, and and how much of your life you gave away to help develop esports. And make no mistake, what you did is you're part of the foundation of how it got to where it got. So all those people that slept with me in the office for 2 or 3 days straight on a concrete floor to try to get things out on time and events done on time, and doing way more than we ever had any business doing with the budgets that we had, even though we probably went through 14-15 million dollars, in support of this dream. Thank you for everyone, and to all my peers in the community that I used to game and talk shit with. And even if I don't remember you and you've reached out to me, and it seems like I've lost a little bit of my memory in my mind, that's called old age. It's going to come for all of us.
Sure.
Yeah, but yeah, I have a bittersweet history with esports, especially with how things ended up. And I love it. I'll always love it. I'd love to be involved in it again in some capacity. And also rest in peace, Ted Owen, who passed away about a month ago in New York City. He was battling a progressive disease, and among other things, which we don't need to talk about here. Family, long issues with family, and just I think he took the whole GGL thing very hard too, and just I'm gonna miss him, and for what the asshole that he was, the leader that he was, the inspiring guy that he was. Rest in peace, brother. We tried really hard and left a mark, and I hope that eventually the esports community comes around to giving you some recognition, because you deserve it, and the recognition that you get is part of the recognition that everyone who worked for GGL and ultimately deserves too.
This video was kindly supported by Pronogo, Mohammed, Alabdul, Razzaq, Dean Tanglis, James Pederson, VatriSam, ErikHillestad, Andreas Kroknes, Hades, Zumba Gaming, J-Dubs, Tobias Bernasconi, and Alexander Rao. Special thanks, as always, goes out to Jerky's Minion. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for one of my upcoming episodes? Maybe you want to ask more of those questions in that video AMA I do each month. Do you want teasers? Find out who the next guests are for my shows. Well, maybe you even want to take part in one of those crazy donated discussions where we go all over the place. If any of these perks appeal to you, or you want to support the channel, put your money where your mouth is and join the Illuminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.